Welcome to Author's Voice, connecting authors to the world. This program is A House Divided, and I am your host for the day. My name is Bjorn Skaptason. The book we're talking about today is The Calculus of Violence, How Americans Fought the Civil War, and I want to introduce you to our guest, Professor Aaron Sheehan-Dean from Louisiana State University. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I'm going to dive right into a little bit of housekeeping here, but we need to get to this book fast because this is a fascinating book. The Calculus of Violence does, How Americans Fought the Civil War, does come to us from Harvard University Press. The cost is $35. If you're watching this on Facebook, if you're watching this on our Facebook feed, ask questions. Just use the comment section to ask questions. And I've got you right here. I can look you up and see if you're asking questions during the course of the show. If you're watching it on the website, again, authorsvoice.net, you're already there. We provide you with the ability to ask questions, make comments below. And be nice because it's the holiday season. Ask nice questions. Most importantly, order a signed book. The reason we do this is you love signed books. You love first edition signed books. Of course you want to read about calculus, but what you really want is first edition signed books. We do this for collectors. And so order a book, Aaron will sign it, and we will ship it right out to you. Welcome to Author's Voice, Aaron Sheehan-Dean. And before we talk about the book, let's talk about the book right now. I'll clean up the rest of that stuff later. The Calculus of Violence, How Americans Fought the Civil War. What brought you to this project?
So I was originally asked to write an essay on, there was a volume that was going to be sort of comparative civil wars, mostly 20th century. It was by a political scientist, and he wanted an essay on the U.S. Civil War as the kind of anchor to compare the Russian and the Finnish and the Greek Civil Wars. And I thought it would be a short assignment, and I would spend maybe a year doing it, and I would write 12,000 words, and it would be long, but that would be it. And I wrote 20,000 words, and I realized I'd only sort of scratched the surface. And so I had been working on another project, and sort of writing that led me to think, we still don't have a very good handle on some fundamental things about how the war went. And so that's sort of what started me, and that was unfortunately a long time ago, but it's done now. So,
so yeah, that brought you to it, and that brings up a discussion. I haven't talked to you about this yet, a discussion I just had with a colleague in public history who's does battlefield hikes at Shiloh National Military Park. We talked that I had worked there, and I'm going to go back next year. And my friend's idea for next year was he wanted to do a comparative hike of Shiloh and the German wars for unification. And when he said that, I said, well, I've got a book on my desk right now that's coming out next month that you need. And so you sold a copy.
Excellent.
There. You sold a copy of Calculus of Violence. And sometime in April 6th, 2019, people will be walking around the Shiloh battlefield talking about Calculus of Violence and the comparison of violence in the American Civil War, and in this case, the German wars of unification are not necessarily civil wars. They're weird. I don't understand.
They are. I mean, part of this book, and there's less of this in here than I had originally intended, but part of how Americans at the time understood the war was by comparing it to the things that they knew.
Okay.
And the German wars of unification are in the future, but the 30 Years' War was not.
Right.
And so that's certainly when people are thinking about Sherman and what he's doing, the 30 Years' War is one of the kind of historical analogs. And so what I found is that a lot of people use both history and also fiction and memoir from previous conflicts to kind of frame what seems acceptable and what seems excessive in this conflict. So that comparative dimension was something that they did and that I tried to do. I mean, the one of the ones that I talk about in here is the Sepoy Rebellion.
Yes.
Which is a kind of surprising one for most Civil War readers. We don't tend to talk about it very much. But it had occurred in 1857. It's basically a nationalist rebellion against the British Empire in India, which is quite brutally suppressed. And particularly in the North, when the British start sort of criticizing Americans and U.S. conduct in the Civil War, what they do is turn around and say, well, but look what you did in India with the suppression of the Sepoy, and they used that as a kind of defense of their own conduct.
Okay, yeah, and if you read just generally the primary source stuff, the fiction or the newspapers, they talk about the Sepoy Rebellion a lot. You get a lot of references from Americans.
From Americans. It's amazing if you put that term into a newspaper database, it is a kind of ubiquitous reference point. I mean, a lot of people talked about savage war, and they used that to mean how Native Americans had fought against, say, the Americans or against British colonists before this. But then Sepoy becomes, I think, in some senses, a more important shorthand for savage and irresponsible and unjust conduct. So each side is accusing the other side of behaving like a Sepoy.
Right, right. And again, the Sepoy always ends up being the other in this case, even if they're viewed sympathetically. But that's not necessarily part of your book. That's just part of where it goes. But one of the things that your book starts with is this age-old argument: was the Civil War the first modern war? Was it the last Napoleonic War? The age-old answer is change. There's a change occurring, so it's not one or the other. But what I want to ask you is, from the book, what kind of changes do you see happening between 1861 and 1865?
Well, I mean, the big change, and this comes in a book that you all probably have, Lincoln's Code by John Fabian Witt from a couple of years ago, an award-winning book, which really emphasized the Lieber Code. This was Francis Lieber, who was a German immigrant who'd come to the U.S., taught law in South Carolina, and then in 1860 finally gets the appointment he's been waiting for, which is to move to Columbia and become a law professor there. And he becomes a kind of advisor to the Lincoln administration, and he writes during the war a code of conduct for Union forces that's released in April of 1863. So that process of formalizing what can and cannot be done is a big part of what makes this an era of change. Now, a lot of Civil War historians would say, yes, that happened, but Lieber's Code didn't have much influence. Henry Halleck, who's Lincoln's general-in-chief for part of the war and a sort of senior bureaucrat, he thinks this is important, and he distributes it to all his generals. So I'm certainly certain that everyone saw it, and they thought about it. And it's also important to note that they are, in fact, prosecuting American soldiers for violations of it. So part of the story I tell later on in the book are the ways in which the U.S. Army held its soldiers to account, both for the Lieber Code and then in general for what they could and couldn't do. We don't have the records for the Confederacy. When Richmond is burned in 1865, and they're sort of dumping things out of windows and setting fire to them in the streets, as Richmond is being evacuated, all those court-martials, or most of those court-martials, get burned. So it's much harder. We have some of them, and there's a batch of about 17,000 Confederate court-martials that I use to try to explore that same question for the Confederates. And it seems clear that they're doing something similar. That is, when their soldiers violate the code of conduct that is kind of generally understood to be the laws of war, soldiers can be held to account for that. You can't direct violence at non-combatants, at civilians, at soldiers who have been wounded or captured or already surrendered. There are exceptions to that, and black soldiers are the big exception for Confederates. But in general, certainly with regard to white soldiers, there is a fair amount of policing of conduct that hadn't happened much, certainly in the Napoleonic campaigns, even among those people who sort of prided themselves on the laws of war. So that's one of the changes that's happening.
Okay. And what I want folks at home to know is that this is a fine, scholarly, analytical book, and also extraordinarily well written. And one of the first questions you asked me when we met today, Aaron, was when did you get into Civil War and all that? And we've both lived through, it's been at least a generation, predates probably either of us. But Americans have lived through a period where academic history, where we just tolerated some deadly prose. I don't know how I survived being a fan of the Civil War when I read all these books from the 60s where there's 3,000 words describing the graph that we're going to show you, and then we show you the graph, and then there's 3,000 words talking about the graph that we just showed you. And that's been over for at least a generation. My advisor said people used to get away with this stuff and you guys aren't. What I want you at home to know, this is an analytical book about Americans, and it talks about the laws of war, and it talks about codes of conduct, and it talks about social history. There's some cultural history, and it is brilliantly written. It just flies along. It's good prose. It's a fun book to read. It touches on really interesting topics, and then moves right along to the next one. Congratulations on that. I want to. But I guess what I don't want folks at home thinking is because we're talking about a scholarly book that it's not going to be fun to read. In fact, it's a page turner. You really want to get into it and get on with it and learn these stories. But I also want to frame, in the early chapters, you frame the story you're going to tell, and the frame is a big one. It's a worldwide frame. So one of the questions you ask right up front is, who gets to make a war? And what is a nation state, and why does a nation state, and does a nation state have monopoly on violence? And does that play out or not play out in the Civil War? And you talk about that a little bit right up front. You build a big frame within to put this story.
Yeah, and I mean, this is key to the whole way in which each side tried to justify what it was doing in this conflict. Because both sides, of course, in any war, you're trying to deny your enemy legitimacy. And Lincoln does this consistently, right? Lincoln never refers to the Confederate States without sort of air quotes or the so-called, they say the so-called Confederate States all the time, because they do not want to make the mistake of somehow admitting that the Confederacy is actually a nation on its own. For Lincoln, the southern states are always in a state of irregular relationship to the federal government. He initially calls it an insurrection. I talk about this as well. This is an enormously problematic term in the 19th century because for most white Southerners, an insurrection was when slaves rebelled. And so for Lincoln to then use that same language, which is the kind of clinical language you would use to describe what happens, it conjures up and it sort of confuses what they understood as insurrection. For the Confederacy, it's equally important that they be able to establish themselves as a legitimate state that can exercise and legitimately make war. Lincoln, and this comes to a head very early on, I mean, in the first couple of months, as the North is confronted with the prospect of either taking regular prisoners, respecting those men as soldiers, or not. And the crisis point comes with several ships that are issued letters of marque by the Confederate government. They're captured by the Union Navy and then brought in. One ship goes to New York and two to Philadelphia, if I have that right, or maybe the reverse. But in the New York case in particular, they are tried before a local judge, and the trial is effectively for treason. And one of the questions that the judge asks the jury is there a state of war? And the jury, of course, feels totally inequipped. Just to, we're impaneled to decide, did they did they kill people or didn't they? Was this a burglary or not? And here they're being called to weigh in on this monumental question. Jefferson Davis makes it quite clear to Lincoln that if these sailors are not treated as legitimate captured public enemies, but are treated as criminals, and are executed, I will start executing the soldiers that we've captured. And so Lincoln backs away from that, takes those men out of the civilian courts, puts them into a prisoner of war camp, and the tensions de-escalate. But it's a moment when you see that the Civil War could have gone in a very different direction had not both sides effectively, and Lincoln does this, you can sense kind of swallowing his frustration here, I'm going to accept for the time being that we will treat them like a state even though they aren't. Sort of every phrase has a little asterisk. Don't think that because I'm taking your men prisoner, I respect them as actual soldiers. They are still American citizens, not Confederates, and so on.
Right.
So, but that big framing is, and it's also important internationally to then claiming support and trying to win the French or the British to your side.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of this starts with someone that you mentioned by name before you got into Francis Lieber, but Old Brains Henry Halleck was thinking about this for a long time and had produced an enormous treatise on the laws of war that I'm sure everybody could quote the title of and nobody had read.
Yes.
But then he ends up becoming the agent of the implementation of these policies. And like you said, he didn't just contact Francis Lieber about what became General Order Number 100. He had also, when he was in Missouri, he had questions about guerrillas.
Yes.
And what are guerrillas? And what was Lieber's take on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is where Lieber begins, because you're right. Halleck asks him to write a pamphlet, he says, or a short piece on the status of guerrillas. And the pamphlet is fascinating because Lieber had been born in basically today's Germany, had come of age, actually fought against Napoleon. And so I think his sympathies naturally were sort of with the underdogs. And so he, in the guerrilla pamphlet, he makes this sort of either 8 or 10 part division of the various kinds of guerrillas. And for Lieber, there is a legitimate sort of popular uprising, a kind of people's war. And this would have been, the analog for this would have been Spain when Napoleon invades the Iberian Peninsula in 1812 and 13 and 14, and that conflict is going on. The Spanish government collapses, and it's citizens who rise up and resist the approach of Napoleon's army. This is famously in Goya's painting, the 3rd of May,
yes,
with the crucified peasant. And that kind of resistance had, that's where we get the term guerrilla, right? It's a Spanish
little
term.
Warrior.
Little warrior.
Yeah.
And so people, I think, certainly with an animus against Napoleon, sort of guerrillas had some kind of popular favor. And what Lieber makes clear is, if there is no central state, it's sort of legitimate for the people to rise up. But if you have a central state, then you conduct war like any other state. And what the Confederacy effectively does is tries to have it both ways. And this creates enormous problems for them because they have a regular state and they have a regular army and they offer commissions and they manage them and they follow the laws of war. And then also there are thousands of irregulars who are operating on behalf of the Confederacy that Davis more or less accepts. And in some cases kind of encourages. And that creates a very dangerous precedent, and of course it encourages what is effectively a counterinsurgency. They didn't use that language then, but that's the modern terminology. But the U.S. waging an anti-guerrilla campaign that's quite brutal, and that subjects Confederate civilians to a lot of rarely outright physical violence, but certainly a great deal of hardship.
And certainly what's happening here is, this is what's one of the fascinating things about the book. While Old Brains Halleck and Francis Lieber are talking and thinking about guerrillas in Spain and the Iberian Peninsula, Missourians are slaughtering each other. And some of them are guerrillas, and some of them are, and some of them are this whole rat's nest of sort of soldiers that Halleck created with the Enrolled Missouri Militia and the Provisional Enrolled Missouri Militia and Missouri State Militia. It's just a mess, and it all is happening while the bloodletting is on.
Missouri is Missouri is really the worst place for this kind of internecine violence that's happening, often neighbor against neighbor. But there are guerrillas in every Confederate state and several Union ones, and so guerrillas are, alongside the treatment of black soldiers, guerrillas are one of the most problematic parts of the Civil War in terms of the nature of violence and the ways in which those boundaries get drawn. Because when regular soldiers, Confederate and Union, meet on battlefields, they respect each other, they respect flags of truce, they offer aid and comfort at many points, but that never happens with guerrillas. And guerrillas upset that, and they, of course, anger and make Union soldiers much less sympathetic towards Confederates when they meet them, even in regular instances. And so we see in Missouri that process of sort of in between what the laws or theories of war might be and how this system is developing there on the ground. And also, I would say, in Arkansas and in parts of Kentucky and Western North Carolina, Western Virginia. The Union, Dan Sutherland's book on this, A Savage War, is, sort of presents the whole guerrilla story. And I think Dan's correct that the Union develops a very effective counterinsurgency strategy to deal with them. It takes time. Halleck sort of fumbles through it in Missouri. But it leads to a great deal of killing. Those guerrillas, because what Lieber's decision on this is, if men are found not in uniform and without a regular command, or taking off a uniform and going home and sort of disguising themselves, those men are not regular soldiers and they do not merit the laws of war, which means effectively he calls them they're highwaymen, which means they can be killed immediately. So the Union Army, when they catch these men, hold drumhead court-martials, 5 minutes of you were the one on the horse with the Kentucky rifle sniping at our men, and then they shoot them. We don't know how many died that way. Certainly thousands. And at the same time, I would say the Union also tries when it can to non-violently handle guerrillas. That is, Grant, for instance, in his campaigns coming down into Tennessee, he captures thousands of men who are accused of being bushwhackers and then sends them north to prisons, knowing that the more men he kills, the more he alienates the South. And this is one of those consistent pressures that helps ameliorate the violence of the war, is that Lincoln wants to reunify. And so you have to conduct this war in a way that doesn't leave a totally embittered white South.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And then, to bring us into another thing that you find very important in the way that people lived and experienced and viewed the war, this war occurred right in the midst of the Second Great Awakening. So everybody that's making these, not everybody, but
everyone had been exposed.
Yeah, but everybody, all of the men, all of the soldiers, the civilians, almost all of them had been exposed to this fiery evangelical faith. And so they all had to deal with faith, with their trust in God and what they thought God would do. And some of them were pacifists and had to deal with that. And some of them were quite happy saying, God says I get to kill you.
They went the other direction.
Yeah.
No.
But how did that work on people, on the society's mind?
Well, I mean, that was one of the fascinating parts, was to read what ministers are saying and what people of faith are saying. And I mean, I guess it's not a huge surprise that is in other conflicts, people find ways of sort of drawing religious faith or interpreting God's favor on them. That is, that it sanctions their behavior. So ministers who are encouraging the armies to go forth and kill. I mean, I found some degree of discrepancy. My first book was on Virginia, on non-slaveholders, and it was a sort of study of Virginia, mostly of the Confederates and their experience. And there,
what the Confederates fought for?
Yes, why Confederates fought as well.
Why the Confederates fought, yeah.
And what I saw there was a lot of fatigue that came from the act of killing. And this is one of the questions lingering as I took up this assignment to write the essay initially, which was that soldiers in their letters, both Northern and Southern, express discomfort with the act of killing. The scale of the Civil War, the nature of the bloodshed, the intimacy of the violence unsettled many men. And in the Virginians whose letters I read for that first book, many of them would write home and say, you know, frankly, this is awful. I've seen men's bodies broken and blown apart, and I just want to come home and never see this again. There's none of this, you know, the sense that we have today of it being a kind of glorious, heroic struggle is a kind of veneer on what was a very bloody and unpleasant experience. So I expected to find more sort of tension between what this emerging evangelical Christianity was saying and what people were wound up doing. What I found was that it was easier for people to reconcile those things. And I mean, particularly fascinating for me was the story of abolitionists, for whom the Second Great Awakening points towards the end of slavery as the ultimate good, right? As the ultimate expression of bringing our world into conformity with what Jesus had preached. And they start the war as pacifists, many of them, William Lloyd Garrison most famously. But over the course of the war, or I would say over the course of that first year, they come to see that this war needs to be prosecuted as strongly as possible in order to make sure that slavery is truly extinguished. That this is now a real opportunity. So even Garrison finds himself sort of on the side of military force and violence. And abolitionists wind up being some of the most eager proponents of a hard and powerful war, when 10 years earlier they had disavowed, you know, any military action whatsoever. So it's an interesting kind of reversal. We tend to regard today the political liberals as the doves and the political conservatives as the hawks. And in the 19th century, those poles are reversed.
Right.
You know, it's the Democrats who are talking about the laws of war. That is the conservative Democrats, and the abolitionists who are saying sort of, go fight on.
Right, exactly. And this also brings up the concept of a righteous cause, which you discuss, but that is, a righteous cause can be a secular cause as well as a religious cause. But Americans needed, as you say, Americans needed to feel like they were fighting for a righteous cause. And what elements of a cause might make it righteous or unrighteous according to the two publics that are looking at it?
Well, and there is, I mean, what's important to remember is these are two democracies fighting one another. I mean, French revolutionary historians will tell us that the French Revolution was the first People's War.
Yes.
I would dispute that and argue that it's the Civil War. because this is the first time when the entire war is sort of structured through open and public democracies. Now, they are not our democracies. They are both slaveholding democracies in 1861. They're democracies that exclude women. We can see all the problems with them as democracies. But what I was intrigued by was the open sort of discourse that democracies engender and enable and are dependent upon. And in both cases, the publics form an important part of determining what's legitimate to do and what isn't. When do we see the public sort of acting to restrain their own armies? We tend to think that that's a kind of 20th century feature, that in a sort of post-Vietnam era in which the media are exposing what's happening, that didn't happen earlier. But in fact, I would argue that in both the North and the South, the newspapers and the public are monitoring their army very carefully. They want their army to reflect them. They want their army to behave properly. So there's both the question of righteousness in terms of what you're fighting for, and the Confederates claimed to be fighting for national autonomy, which they considered a righteous cause, and the North considered itself to be fighting for the perpetuation of the Union, which Lincoln and others felt to be righteous. But there was also the righteousness of how you fight. And so in this case, both publics want their army to embody the best of how you're supposed to behave, that the method of fighting, the process of fighting, is part of what makes your war legitimate.
Did you find fatigue on the part of the civilians as the war changed? Can you find Northerners saying, I thought this was a great war, but now that we're killing all of these people, maybe we should stop? Is that?
Well, there are certainly Democrats that say that.
Yeah.
It's hard to disentangle the extent to which they are merely seeking an opportunity to kind of chip away at the Lincoln administration.
Politics is always going,
right,
doing what it does.
Yes, I mean, because of course during the Mexican War, you didn't find a lot of Democrats sort of talking about the laws of war.
The humanity.
Right, they weren't very concerned with the fate of Mexican civilians. Yeah. But they do know many of these white Southerners, right? And they are aligned with them. I mean, we were talking before the show about the journal by the Michigander who goes down in 1859. Right. I mean, I teach at Louisiana State University. William Tecumseh Sherman, an Ohioan, is the first president of LSU, which very few people know. Mm-hmm. He got along fabulously with white Southerners and didn't have any personal animus. So there are personal relationships and there are kind of networks of affiliation that do, I think, generate a sense of concern about what Northern armies are doing as they occupy, as they invade. On the other hand, there's, of course, what Charlie Royster chronicled years ago in The Destructive War, his book, which is a kind of bloodthirstiness, that the public living what he called a vicarious war is actually encouraging its army to be more aggressive than soldiers would want to be. And I think both those things are operating. That is, there are parts of the public that are acting as a restraint and parts of the public that are fueling violence and are encouraging a more destructive conflict.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And which does bring, again, it brings us to the the question of violence and the specifics of violence. And a few weeks ago, we had Joanne Freeman on the show. I'm going to show her book. That's the Field of Blood, which is doing so well. I'm so happy that people are reading this book and really enjoying it. But and one of the things that Freeman finds, it's a surprise, is that there's violence in Congress. Sure, everybody knows that Butler, Kane, right, Sumner. She finds something like 70
right,
acts of violence in Congress, amongst congressmen. And one thing what you point out in Calculus of Violence at one point is at the point when we're coming up on the Civil War and during the Civil War, Americans, tell me if I got this wrong, Americans thought of themselves as a uniquely violent people. But what were some of the forms of violence that they were countenancing, I guess they like to think they were tough. They were frontier people. We lived with...
They certainly thought that. I mean, I would say, what's important about the nature, I don't know that the Americans were any more violent than Western Europeans. Mm-hmm. What part of what Professor Freeman points out that's so effective in this book is that a lot of that congressional violence happened around slavery, right? The caning of Sumner in particular.
Yeah.
Is that slavery itself is, of course, built on violence, the violence that's meted out to enslave people and that stands as a threat. But by the 1840s and 50s, the violence of slavery had spread out to white people. And so the conflicts that people are having, and these of course culminate in the 1850s in bloody Kansas, the number of riots that we can now chronicle over these decades, I mean, there's something like 1,200 riots in the decade and a half before the Civil War. The vast majority of them sort of concerning slavery or runaway slaves or the return of runaway slaves or abolitionists, which isn't to say that Americans were sort of ready and anticipating war, because I don't think that they were, but there was certainly a sense that the violence of slavery had spread. And so in some sense, I think, although no one really says this explicitly, they couldn't have been that surprised that what then engulfs them is this catastrophic bloodletting around this question of what is the position of slavery in the United States and what will the future look like.
Mm-hmm. And so, do you think they got more inured to public violence
Before the war?
Before the war?
I don't know that they did on this scale. I mean, I think the episodes that Professor Freeman chronicles in the book and the ones that we know about, Kansas is an exception because Kansas was a kind of broad-based public violence in the 1856, 1857. The episodes that she chronicles are sort of isolated individual instances that are interpersonal violence. And I think the scale of public violence in the war is much different. Of course, it's so dramatically beyond anything that had happened in North America before. I mean, up to that, when Bull Run transpires, that's basically the largest battle in terms of casualties in North America. And by the time we get to the Overland Campaign in 1864, they effectively fight a battle of Bull Run every day for 6 weeks. Mm-hmm. Right? And so certainly during the war, there was a process of, and this is part of what's fascinating to me, is that sort of regular people find themselves able to acclimate to more and more bloodshed. Even people who despise it, right, evangelicals and others, people who were committed pacifists, nonetheless find themselves drawn into this process by which the deeper you're invested, the more it becomes necessary.
Right. Well, okay, you've talked about, for the folks at home here, we've gotten more than halfway through our interview, and we're still talking about sort of the heady stuff and the people thinking and writing and so on. And so much of this book, probably more than not, is about the battlefield, is about how these machines of violence operated and how the people operated them, how the people holding the levers operated them. So you mentioned Bull Run, and you mentioned during the Overland Campaign there's a Bull Run every day. But one thing you do mention in the book is you put the Battle of Fredericksburg in a particularly interesting light. Do you think that Fredericksburg is a particular, is there a particular spike in the ground when Fredericksburg happens? Or is that just something that you saw as a particularly interesting combination?
Yeah, I mean, I saw Fredericksburg as important because of the public discussion that happens about the fate of civilians there. Mm-hmm. So we know that the battle itself is terribly bloody. We know the story of that battle, George Rabel's fantastic book.
Yes.
That sort of, basically the incompetence of Burnside and the command that continued pushing those men up there that produces such a lopsided outcome. But what people at the time paid attention to was both that and also the destruction of the town and the forced exile of these citizens. There are about 4,000 or so citizens of Fredericksburg. It's a kind of old colonial port town on the Rappahannock-Rapidan River, and they're kind of exile into the wilderness, as it were, heading south towards Richmond. Lee chose to fight there, and so he's the one responsible for the exodus of these people, and Lee chose to make his defense in the city, right? The northern troops are on the northern bank of the river, and they're trying to get pontoon bridges built and move their troops across, and they can't because there are sharpshooters in these buildings. There are a whole bunch of features of Fredericksburg that look very much like modern warfare. Mm-hmm. The first amphibious landing in American military history happens when the regiments, the attack regiments, row across and then begin battling up the riverbank into the streets. There's then street level fighting there as the Confederates retreat up onto the heights behind the town. And then there is this sort of orgy of destruction that Union soldiers in a now empty town commit as a way of sort of releasing their frustration with what had happened, both with the kind of refusal of Confederates to allow them, as they saw it, to cross normally and then have a bona fide battle on a battlefield. And certainly Confederates make a great deal of the suffering of those civilians. The papers of the mayor, Thomas, he's appropriately named mayor, his last name is Slaughter, Thomas Slaughter of Fredericksburg. People all around the South write to him in sympathy, and they see those civilians that were sort of pushed out of the town as the victims of this awful Yankee war. Now, mind you, those civilians are not subjected to any actual personal violence. They had left before the battle starts. The Union Army never targets them. And as people at the time recognized, Edwin Sumner, who's the Union general commanding the forces that are proposing to take the town, he says to the mayor, you have allowed your town to be used for military purposes, so you have until 5 p.m. today to clear out, and then I'm going to begin a bombardment. And Lee knew this as well. I mean, Lee could have easily backed to the North Anna River or one of the other spots in that region and made a defensive line, but as happened in many Confederate cities, he chose to build a defensive line in the city. And the result is it subjects those civilians to violence, and then what you have is this kind of wartime debate about who's responsible. I would say that Lee and other Confederate officers know that if you retreat into a city, you bear responsibility for the civilians that happen to be damaged or hurt in the battle. And the Union knows this as well. The Union High Command never discusses whether you can attack Vicksburg or whether you can attack Atlanta. Those are towns where Confederate armies have sequestered themselves. They have made them prime for attack, and there's no need to kind of worry excessively about the civilians there.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, Fredericksburg turns out to be a really fascinating battle in that all of these different factors come together at the same time on the same battlefield, and then there's a takeaway from it. There's a reaction especially in the North, to the bloodletting, and it happens at a particularly unique political time. So anyway, I enjoyed that particular take. Thank you. Something you mentioned before, though, is that in terms of who gets to do violence and who is subject to violence, the Civil War always has this wild card factor that comes out, and that is the people who are enslaved or have been enslaved. African American people fall into some special category. And so that must have been a real challenge for you once you've gotten your mind around what people thought violence would be. Okay, then how are we going to deal with the people who aren't thought of as being fully people?
Right. And that's the key sort of problem for how the Confederates would frame that. That is that enslaved men or even free men of color for the North can't be legitimate soldiers. And this both comes out of a cultural supposition that black men aren't men in the way that white men are, and so can't function as soldiers in the same way, and so should not be allowed to participate as soldiers. The Union doesn't agree with that. The Union standing rule from the beginning of the war, or from the beginning of the enlistment of black soldiers, which happens irregularly in 1862 and then officially after the Emancipation Proclamation, is any man wearing a Union uniform is a free man, whether he's black or white, and the result is he should be treated like a soldier. That is, if captured on the battlefield, subjected to the regular rules for being a prisoner of war. And the Confederacy doesn't do this consistently. There's a huge debate back and forth, and it finally comes to the point that Lincoln has to issue an ultimatum that where he says to Jefferson Davis, if you don't treat black soldiers as regular prisoners and you execute them, I will begin executing Confederate prisoners on a one-for-one. This is the law of retaliation, which actually turns out to be quite important to the Civil War as well. And that helps de-escalate, but never entirely diminish the unjust violence that black soldiers experience. Because as you point out, the kind of Confederate mindset here is that these men cannot be, as not men, they can't be real soldiers, and they aren't granted that respect. So we don't have a good count on this. Hundreds, maybe thousands of black men were killed unjustly by Confederates. It's hard to know exactly. And in some cases, the Union took action to try to right those situations, try to hold someone responsible. And in other cases, they didn't, in a way that they surely would have if it had been white soldiers. Mm-hmm. So the Union is hardly blameless in this context.
Right. And then one of the most often quoted Confederate responses that I've seen is Edmund Kirby Smith out there in the Trans-Mississippi when one of his commanders said, what should I do with these black prisoners? His response is, I wish you wouldn't have taken black prisoners.
Don't take black
now,
prisoners.
was he telling them to kill him, or was he telling them, don't make this my decision because I don't want to do it?
Yeah, I read that as don't
that.
allow them to surrender.
Yeah.
Refuse to accept surrender. But as I say, that had been a standard part of the protocol that both Confederate and Union armies offered to each other throughout the conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So this race again marks this sort of crucial distinction where his solution, and it's a kind of ad hoc solution that's not sanctioned from on high. Lee, for instance, is a little more scrupulous about this, though there are atrocities committed under his in his army as well. But the idea is he's telling Richard Taylor, don't let those men surrender. Make sure that you continue fighting until they're all killed. Mm-hmm. And that feeds its own sort of mini cycle of retribution when black soldiers, after, for instance, Fort Pillow in April of 1864, Nathan Bedford Forrest famously takes prisoners later in the summer and writes a letter of complaint to Washburn, the commander in Memphis, saying, I understand that from these soldiers that they've took an oath never to surrender and to kill every Confederate they meet. Can you tell me if that's true? And Washburn, who was a kind of old New England abolitionist family, said, I didn't say that, but I hope it's true. I mean, he met it with more vigor. A more political general would have said, well, I don't know, let me investigate. Mm-hmm. And Washburn says, what else can you expect given what happened at Fort Pillow? You inaugurated the black flag, that is refusing to allow surrender, right. And so these soldiers are going to do that, and I hope your troops suffer. That was a somewhat unusual response, but we know that black troops are aware. They are reading the newspapers and they're hearing stories and they're meeting people who had been at Fort Pillow. The U.S. Congress does a huge investigation and releases a very extensive record with lots of testimony. So the public record is very clear. People know that they were exterminated, effectively. They were massacred at Fort Pillow and in other places, Poison Spring and other spots around the Confederacy. And so that dynamic certainly increases the lethality of the war.
Mm-hmm. And then what's the response from black soldiers? So where do you see that? Where do you see that retributive wrath?
Well,
if we're going to kill all of each other, and it's going to be a race-based killing, where's the other Fort Pillow? Where's the other Poison Spring?
Yeah, so there actually isn't one.
Yeah.
This, I think, is an important point here. I mean, so the rhetoric is there on rare occasions. Mm-hmm. But what I find is that what black men saw was the opportunity here is to join the regular U.S. Army and to fight as a regular American and hopefully a citizen, right? Douglas says, once let the black man get the buttons and on his shoulder and the U.S. on his, mm-hmm. on his epaulets, and no power on earth can keep him from being a citizen. That by participating in this, we are making ourselves men. We are claiming membership in the United States in a way that had been denied to us. So they're, in fact, I think, quite scrupulous about their behavior as soldiers. And this is one of the things that actually helps diminish the violence of the war as a whole, is that both enslaved people who free themselves and those men who participate in the regular armies in the USCT follow the laws of war and obey those. They know they're being watched very carefully. And so I think they monitor their own conduct in a pretty scrupulous way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there's so much in this book, and there's so much really great stuff in this book. So there's no point in our conversation trying to do everything. No. After all, they need to buy it and read it. None of these topics we're discussing, we're not even coming close to the stories that you've been able to tell. And you tell all, not just the analysis, but these great stories that you find. But one thing that I do want to make sure we get to, because we've done the discussion of the Confederate treatment of U.S. colored troops and so on, if there's one episode of violence that we've had to live with for generations and generations, at least the knowledge of it, it is this. It is the story of Sherman and his bummers. And we have for generations, we've heard about this violence of Sherman's bummers and the March to the Sea and the violence against civilians. Recent scholarship has put the lie to some of the more gruesome tales that we're told, and pointed out that the story go to these small southern cities, and the pamphlet on Sherman burning the city is right next to the pamphlet on the tour of antebellum homes.
Right. The courthouse.
Yeah, the court. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's a wonderful irony, but it does not address the fact that this was an extraordinary act of violence. And so you had to, at some point, wrestle with what is Sherman's march?
Yeah.
And what are the boundaries of that violence?
And I would argue that it is still a march that is primarily destructive. That is, the violence they mete out is violence against animals and against Confederate troops and against buildings and public stores and against private barns. In Georgia, certainly fewer homes than in South Carolina, where Sherman is much less vigorous about prosecuting soldiers. It is extremely rare to find Sherman's army committing acts of personal violence against Confederate civilians. And this is what makes the Civil War so much different than the 20th century conflicts that we are familiar with, right? With the nature, with what air superiority gives you and allows you to do, that we see in World War, to a lesser extent in World War I, but certainly in World War II, the kind of bombing of civilian spaces. Sherman, the violence that comes when Sherman reaches Atlanta and decides to lay siege to it. And as I said earlier, there are citizens there, not very many. I mean, they knew that he was coming. The wartime population of Atlanta is about 20,000. There are only about 2,000 people there when Sherman arrives. The vast majority have left. Hood's defensive lines are quite close in on the city, and Sherman is overshelling deliberately, trying to kind of create chaos in that space. But even 5 weeks of round-the-clock shelling, though it's almost impossible to believe, only yields 20 civilian deaths. And I don't want to make light of 20 civilian deaths, but certainly on any scale, either after it, think of Dresden or the bombing of London, or even before it with the 30 Years' War, 20 deaths is a small number, a kind of remarkably small number. And so Sherman is thinking about reunion. He is also thinking about what it's legitimate to do. You direct violence against enemy soldiers. And that's generally what he does on the march. Now, it's certainly true that after they leave Savannah and come into South Carolina, there's a lot more destruction of private homes. And I would also say, because I addressed this in that chapter as well, there's also sexual violence used against women. Some of this from the bummers, as you say. That is, yes. These are men who may be Union deserters or maybe they're Confederate deserters and they're sort of following Sherman's army. What he is certainly guilty of here is not regulating those troops as closely as he should have. He allows them to subsist. And the result is that violence that they commit that is sort of outside of the bounds of war. And part of the problem with the laws of war is these are not regular soldiers. The laws of war don't really apply to them. That is, those people can't be court-martialed. I mean, if you call
unless you catch them.
Unless you catch them. But Sherman doesn't devote much energy to this. And he certainly had the troops that he could have. We don't know much about the use of rape in the Civil War. Crystal Feimster at Yale is writing a book on this now. I mean, my own research, right, which we need.
Yeah.
I mean, my research for this demonstrates that rapes happened, usually perpetrated, I mean, more often against enslaved women or women of color in the South than white women. And the Union Army prosecuted its soldiers when they found them doing this. So this was not a kind of method of war that was sanctioned. And this is too part of the rumor that we hear around Sherman is that his troops attacked women. I mean, Emma LeConte, the famous diarist in Columbia, South Carolina, who despises Sherman. She's the one that exults when Lincoln's assassination is announced. Emma LeConte says Sherman's soldiers committed every atrocity short of ravishment. And she's very clear about this didn't happen. You know, there are reasons for her to dissemble, but I think that testimony is reinforced by the difficulty of finding evidence of Sherman soldiers or of Northern soldiers committing rape on a widespread scale. Certainly Confederates would have been eager to publicize that. So there are instances, and I think it's important that we understand how this works. There are crimes of opportunity, but it's also important to recognize that the Union Army is prosecuting men vigorously. Most of those who are charged and convicted are executed.
Right.
And I suspect the same might have been true in the Confederate armies. We know nothing about this as the problem of sexual violence with relationship to Confederate armies. So that's sort of wide open for investigation.
It is an open question, and although you talk about, you address it in this, it's an open question because the next thing we're going to come up with is just as African American men were not really men and therefore not subject to the rights and privileges of soldiers, women of color are not really women to the common Confederate soldier, the common Union soldier. So sexual violence, we see sexual violence against enslaved women or freed African American women as sometimes tossed around as a matter of course.
And it's, I mean, right, those stories are among the most heartbreaking. I mean, the violence that is directed, even if it's sort of randomly
it's never called a rape because it's not in their minds.
Right, the violence against enslaved people from the side of, from Union troops, which happens at a couple of key points, is sort of heartbreaking given our supposition that Northern troops are there, certainly after 1863, as a kind of emancipatory force. But many soldiers came with this, many Northern soldiers came with the same racial attitudes that Southern soldiers held. And the result was a kind of gross mistreatment of many of those people.
Well, people really need to dig into this book in order to unpack some of these details. So I just want to move back to, come back out to the big picture one more time, because one of the things you've said talking about the book, and I've seen in some reviews, the calculus of violence does ask the question of, was this the first total war, or to what extent was the American Civil War violence unhinged? And I think, don't correct me if I'm misquoting you, but at some point you've said, essentially, this is the worst war we've ever had, and it could have been so much worse than it was.
That is to say, it's sort of my answer is both and, rather than one or the other. And I mean, I try to have that not be a coy answer or the sort of cop-out answer. The Civil War is just in many respects and unjust in other respects. And I think part of what we learn from studying the Civil War is that all wars are like this. That it is impossible for us to find a war that is sort of consistently just in its origins and just in its execution. That is, in its sort of process of fighting. And you know, we have in the Civil War, in the historiography, in the literature on the Civil War, we write a lot about a lot of these episodes in a way that imbues them with a kind of nobility that sort of shades or conceals what might have been going on underneath. And I think it's important that we recognize the outcome of preserving the Union is a good one for contemporary Americans. Ending slavery is demonstrably a moral good. So the war accomplishes those just ends, but at the same time, it is a war that involves Americans in unjust actions. And so if we go into wars thinking we can make a kind of unilateral decision about a just conflict or know our unjust enemies, we fundamentally misunderstand how war operates. And so we basically have to retool the calculus in every conflict. We have to be mindful of how we as an army and we as a country behave and what we sanction and what we don't sanction. And this was true then and it's true now.
Well, thank you very much for that. We're going to come back and talk about some more things in a minute, but I do want to pick up one of those pieces of housekeeping that I told you I wasn't going to do before. I want to introduce you to Aaron. You've been listening to him talk for almost an hour, and Aaron Sheehan-Dean is the Fred C. Fry Professor of Southern Studies at Louisiana State University. And he's the author of Why the Confederates Fought, and the author or editor of at least 6 or 7 other books. And this book is The Calculus of Violence, How Americans Fought the Civil War. It's from Harvard University Press. The cost is $35. And if you're watching this on Facebook Live or on our website, you can definitely still put some comments in there. We're going to check and see if you made any comments. I'm looking at my producer here. We're going to see if you made any comments that don't show up until after it's over, because the internet does this to us sometimes. we're done, you leave, suddenly there's 6 questions that pop up on the internet. And so if we have a chance to do that, and if you did ask questions and Aaron is still here, we might respond either on Facebook or on our website. And so we are reaching the end of our program, and think about coming back to Author's Voice next year. This is our last program of 2019, and I thank you, everybody who has participated in Author's Voice by watching the programs, by ordering the books, by submitting questions. Remember, I told you right now you're just watching A House Divided, one of 6 programs on Author's Voice. So there are thousands of you out there that have been enjoying Sonali Dave and Lit with Love and Libby Hellman's Solved, the newest mysteries out there, Betsy Bird with the Kidlit show, Lady Bird and Friends. Thank you so much for participating in Author's Voice this year, 2018. And I hope you'll all join us again, and many more of you will join us next year in 2019 when these shows begin their new season. For A House Divided, it's going to be our 3rd season. And there'll be many more wonderful books coming up. Coming up just in the first couple of weeks of January, Novel Conversations will be back, and the author Stephen Evans Jordan will join us on January 9th, 2019 at 3:30 with his new novel, Tatiana and the Russian Wolves. After that, Stranger Than Fiction, our general nonfiction show, returns. Chris Hartley returns to Author's Voice. He wrote a terrific book about Stoneman's Raid a few years ago, and now he has a new World War II book, Chris Hartley with The Lost Soldier. That will be on January 17th of next year. So ask a question online. We'll try to get back to you if we can. That's at authorsvoice.net. Order a signed book. We're still going to have a few copies of Calculus of Violence left after the show is over. So if you're watching this on the YouTube channel later, there's going to be a link there under the video. Follow that link. You'll be able to fill it out. We'll have a signed copy of Calculus of Violence that we can ship to you, even if it's the 2nd week of January. So once again, thank you, Aaron Sheehan-Dean. Thank you to Harvard University Press for helping us get this show on. And to thank you once again, everybody at home, for participating in Author's Voice, connecting authors to the world. I'm Bjorn Skaptason, and have a great day.